It is about 6:32, so we will go ahead and get started today. Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's new Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Events and Programs Assistant at the museum. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to those who joined us last time. Over the next few weeks, museum staff and volunteers will share programs featuring Pennsylvania transit history topics that you can experience from the comfort of your home. Now, we have some viewers who have visited the museum before, and I see there are lots of volunteers here. But for those who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And the museum opened to visitors just a few years later in 1963 and is actually located along the route of the trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. Here you'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars, about 20 of which operate, and around 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. All right, and now I would like to introduce today's presenter, George Gula. George is an operator and a conductor at the museum. He volunteers in the archives, he gives outreach programs, and he's been here since 1975, or as George says, a long time. He's also been writing for Trolley Fair, the member newsletter, since 1977. Today, George will be presenting When Bad Things Happen to Good Trolleys. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box is open and I see you guys have figured that out. So please feel free to enter questions and comments throughout the show. And afterwards, George will be able to scroll through those and answer them at the end. We'll try to take a little pause at the end as well to save some time for questions and answers. But please keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off during the presentation so that George has all the bandwidth available for the slideshow. All right, George, take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Kristen. I'm going to go through this little preliminary thing that makes Zoom work. But here we are. And there's the title of the show, Crash, Bang, Boom. And bad things happen to trolleys all the time. There is, of course, a very large number of people and organizations that did help contribute to this. So I want to make sure everybody takes a look at this. Without this, I couldn't even do this show. This is in one of the normal days. This is up in my hometown of Scranton. But as you notice what I said out there, whenever a trolley came out of the barn, trouble was never far from its behind. And, you know, you like to see a day like this when everything runs on schedule, that all sorts of things happen. Taken from Walt Disney, The Wonderful World of Traffic. And back in the old days, traffic consisted of Old Dobbin. And Old Dobbin moved about 3 to 5 miles an hour if you were lucky. And he sat, as you can see, right on the rails, made a wonderful passageway, smooth ride, not on that cobblestone in Philly or ligature stone out here. And there's that streetcar getting off schedule. Always a bad thing if you're an operator. I look at this picture, I keep thinking, what's going to happen when those barrels fall? Another shot in Philadelphia on Route 2, and another slow trolley. This was up in Scranton, the old wholesale district, the section of town that was at one time the central part. And here you have all of this chaos out here. 3, 4, 5 trolleys trying to get through a mess of horses, wagons, people carrying everything imaginable. And you can again imagine, what does that do to schedules? Philadelphia. A lot of people burned coal. Anthracite coal came from Scranton, and they had to deliver it. And before coal trucks, they had coal wagons. And this is a trolley trying to make it through. Down on the lower right, not only do we have a coal wagon delivering its Philadelphia Rapid Transit coal car, they had their own coal fleet to take coal to the power plant. And at least once, those doors flew open and coal fell all over the street. And wagons broke down. And everybody was delayed. Wagons also got hit. Many times horses were skittish animals, and the horses remained on city streets long after World War II. I know in Scranton there were horses out there in the 1960s. This is the late 1940s in Philadelphia, and you can see the horse blocking everything up. Motorman trying to be patient. I can hear that bell go now, though. And this is our strip district. as the automobile showed up, and the horse sort of waned away a bit. But there were plenty of cars. There were lousy roads, and they tied up the streetcars as well. And this is around 28th Street, Liberty Avenue, downtown. That's the old Wabash Terminal. So the bus is coming out of what is presently Forbes, but was Diamond Street. That's Liberty Avenue, and over on the left, you're looking down Stanwix, and nobody seems to be moving on this day. Philadelphia, Chestnut Street, I believe, and I think you had two routes here, 42 and 13. At one point, 124 cars an hour passed through here, streetcars, and a lot more automobiles. And this is certainly long after gasoline rationing. Pittsburgh, again, all tied up. Look at the potential for an accident right here. And that operator's got to be real ginger, real alert on the brake. And things broke down. And then they had to be fixed, and the streetcars got delayed again. Another reason, there's an emergency wagon from Philadelphia Transportation Company trying to assist in getting this thing off the track. Trucks made deliveries, and they didn't park very well, as you could see. And there's a whole line of cars backed up behind it. And then this is the shot in McKeesport that I've used quite a bit, because McKeesport has a narrow street. Its main street is Fifth Avenue. It was a major business street at one point, but it was constructed in the 1880s. And certainly wagons were very narrow, and the early automobiles were also very narrow. But after the war, cars got wider, and you had to park on the curb. Obviously, this guy didn't do that. And it's a real mess, and people are trying to go both ways on the other side of the trolley. This one illustrates that even better. He's sticking out about an inch, and you can't make it. And then you would be stuck. 3, 4, 5 cars could be stuck at times up there. Major celebrations posed a problem for the trolleys. This is the day that the Pirates hit the home run in 1960, and Mazeroski, I think, was the man that did it, William Stanley Mazeroski. And people, I was told, were even climbing on top of the cars. So they used those narrow PCC ladders to get on top of the cars. And nowadays in Pittsburgh, they don't let people downtown to celebrate. This is up in Hazleton. A Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton car is moving through, and the parade is going on both sides. And I have no idea what that elk or moose or whatever it is doing down on the left. Looks like part of a float. Must be a lot of fun here. Ticker tape parade. Not only can't you move, you probably can't see. Your window's covered with all this paper. No details on this, but it looks like Cleveland to me. The circus would come to town. Everybody loved the circus except for the company. Transportation company absolutely hated this. This was Pittsburgh, downtown, and this is Chicago. And before anybody gets upset, no, the elephant is not really hurting. He was hot, and they had to give him water. And, you know, he's being assisted by his friend, but it tied everything up pretty badly. Paul Harvey, I used to listen to him on the radio. He used to have a rest of the story, and I threw some miscellaneous stuff in. The trolleys broke down too. Here's an axle being replaced in a truck down by East Ohio Street and the now vanished Lockhart Street over in the north side. They had to take time to do that. And then I don't know who did this. That's a transfer table in a shop, and somebody's run into it. And from other pictures I've seen, this happens to be in D.C., Washington, D.C., but it's not uncommon to probably back it up into that. And now you got to try to get it back up. Track construction, a very necessary evil. And it ties everything up. Look at that line of cars out there in the back, all the way down the street as far as I could see, you know, trying to get through while the crew is replacing the rail. Here's, for the Pittsburgh guys, here is our crane car, M283, on 16th Street, and that's the 16th Street Bridge, and it is involved in replacing rail, and it still runs at the museum, and it's involved in replacing rail. I found this over at the Heritage Center one day in McKeesport. Happy operator going down the line, beautiful fall day. You know, as one of the guys in my Boy Scout troop says, what could go wrong? Well, how about a Menzie dairy truck just sliding off the bridge and, you know, down onto the track? I grew up in Scranton. Some of you guys know that. And we had anthracite mines, and there was daily subsidence. And this happens to be the Scranton line car, taking a look at some of the mine subsidence that has taken place here. Philadelphia, this, according to the newspaper photo, this was a newspaper photo, and somebody whipped the crane around and knocked the trolley over, and there happened to be a truck there, which was probably very fortunate, and it didn't go on its side. Another oops, I don't know how you call this one in. And this was during the war. 2,800-pound casting going down to, I believe, Cramp's shipyard, one of the 7 shipyards on the Delaware, and it falls right in the middle of everything. And nobody could move, and that must have been quite a job getting that massive amount of tonnage out of the street. Bridges, what can go wrong with bridges? How about a railroad car and a load that shifted at the 62nd Street Bridge, kind of knocked the bridge in. It stranded a couple of cars actually on the Sharpsburg, or the north side of the bridge, and they had to repair it. And then somebody scratched his head and said, how do we know the repair is good enough? They didn't do a good one. The bridge was going to be replaced soon anyway. And according to Arthur Ellis, one of our very old, wonderful volunteers, they loaded about 12 or 13 tons of weight into this dump car. Somebody set it off, point one, and it went on its own across the bridge, no operator. Somebody jumped down on the other side, and it didn't fall through. So they figured the bridge was safe. Trolleys didn't want to stay on bridges. Christmas Eve was always a problem, and Christmas Day for some reason. This is the Schuylkill River, Eastern Pennsylvania Railways, running out of Schuylkill Haven up the valley to Pottsville, went off one of the 3 bridges around what was known as Cape Horn. Up at Bolivar, I've been told it's not Bolivar, it's Bolivar, up in Shingle House, which is northern Pennsylvania, near the New York border. And he flew off the bridge. And this is closer to home. This was the back channel of the Ohio River between Neville Avenue, or Neville Island rather, excuse me, and Coriopolis, and he went off. Those bridges were originally part of the 6th Street Bridge. They were floated down when the current bridges were built, coming off of Lincoln Avenue. And this was a very fragile open car that soared off Lincoln Avenue. This is Washington Boulevard today, for anybody familiar with Pittsburgh. The elements, they didn't like trolleys, I guess. And we're going to start with fires. Fires usually involve buildings, and they involved a lot of hoses. And the hoses would tie up the street, and then you couldn't get the trolleys through. Now, Philadelphia Rapid Transit developed this little ingenious device, and that device was the hose jumper. And they could run a whole series of hoses under these. They fit them to the track. You probably could put several hose jumpers on them. Here it is in actual service in Philadelphia. And some of you guys from Philly, I know, are watching. How you doing? I'm sure you guys might know exactly where this is. They caught fire sometimes, usually by hitting a truck of some kind. This was a gasoline truck, streetcar fire in Chicago, about 1950 or so, and this did involve some loss of life. This wasn't so bad, but it was down south of Philadelphia, and it was a fire, another tank truck hitting a streetcar on a wooden bridge, and this was on Route 37, and it brought the shortening of Route 37 on earlier than it probably would have been. I know the state of Pennsylvania was planning to do a new road here, and the trolleys would have gone anyway. Woodland Barn, in 1975, the barn went up in flames, the oldest part of the barn. They lost about 58 or 60 streetcars in that barn. And eventually that would cause the loss of 3 or 4 routes up in North Philadelphia. And in Pittsburgh, it was no better. Somebody left a controller point on, point 1 in the Homewood car house. And before it was done, we lost quite a few cars. This one was deliberate. Thomas E. Mitten was president of the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, and he was famous for building some new car houses. They were fireproof. He only had 3 cars per bay, and he had sprinklers. And this was over in West Philly in Callow Hill, where he deliberately set a fire in one of these old cars, and he wanted to show how the sprinklers were going to work. And as you see, didn't quite work quite as well as he hoped. And 6, I believe, was the number of cars that burned. Tornado went through here. Around on the Frankfurt, Tacony, and Holmesburg, so that would be northeast of Philadelphia, knocked down wires and did a lot of destruction. Out here in the McKeesport, Glassport area, there was a tornado about a month before the lines were going to be abandoned down there, and they quickly got permission from the state to abandon them quite early. Floods were very commonplace, and certainly out in Pittsburgh, quite a few floods. And this was out near the Westinghouse plant, and Turtle Creek would flood a lot of times. Turtle Creek would go down, and if you had a double-ended trolley, you were fine. But if you had a single-ended trolley like this, you were stuck. This is down in the Strip District of Pittsburgh, either Penn or Liberty. And Allegheny is flooding over, and people are walking through, and I have no idea, if they have shoes on or not, but there's streetcar stuck back in there, and what cars couldn't move. Of course, motors get wet, and the cars can't move. And, we don't know where this is at all, but it's a nice night picture. We do know this is the 1936 flood. All over the state. It was a horrible flood, and we had a lot of trouble here in Pittsburgh. This is the Valley Railways car on the west side of the Susquehanna River, and it just got caught in the floodwaters, and typical. Now, Pittsburgh had some ingenious trestling they could put up in the strip along Penn Avenue, and that usually, if the water wasn't too high, they could get the cars through by using this trestling. And this is up in Erie. Floodwaters could be severe. And this one was severe enough to take this car and wrap it around a house. Floodwaters, well, you can't have trestling everywhere. This is the 1936 flood in Pittsburgh, down by the point. And the power plant was on the Ohio River, just south of town, Brunet Island. And as I was told by Ed Leibbarger, one of our archivists, when the water got too high, the motors fried out, and then the water got higher. And cars just sat there waiting to get saved. Now, Wilkes-Barre, I know, did this with one of their bridges, the Market Street Bridge. We could do this on the 16th Street Bridge, and that means that we could move cars to high ground, and when you needed to, they moved them up on top of some of the bridges. And that usually provided just enough room to clear the water. Wilkes-Barre, you couldn't do that. Susquehanna was 2 blocks away. Nobody knows why, but all the company records survived. Nobody knows where they were. And a number of these cars, including that rotary car right up here, were sold both to San Diego and to Sudbury, Ontario for service during the war. Anybody want to see this? It's June. But snow could present problems. And normally, no, not a problem unless you had some inept driver in front of you. Streetcars could move along pretty well. But when traffic got heavy because the snow got heavy, now was the time to add extra cars and to try to keep the rails clear. And you also had the sweepers out. And this happens to be a sweeper in Scranton, Pennsylvania by the courthouse, Spruce Street, I believe. And those were, for those of you that aren't familiar, those are bamboo brooms. Snow did not stick to bamboo. And we got a lot of it here in Pennsylvania, Northeast PA, particularly Philly. And in Philly, there was a lot of wet snow, clung to everything. And some of these sweepers had no windshield wipers, my understanding was. It's one of the older ones here. And you fought your way through. You had cars stuck out there. Philly had one of the few systems to have and use a rotary plow, which really flung snow with an immense amount of force. And it was fine out here in the country. You can see not too much out there, but where you had a lot of close-in houses and fencing and windows, the rotaries were very unsuccessful. And this was usually the streetcar's problem. Despite the sweepers and despite the extra cars, somebody would get stuck, and now you have to move it. It looks like the operator's out helping the driver of the automobile. This was a whole gang of people here in Pittsburgh, and in the earlier days when you did not have all of the labor issues and the state wasn't involved, a lot of times you'd get a gang of guys and give them some food, give them some coffee, and give them some shovels, and away they went. And I can imagine this operator saying, "Hey kid, you want $1?" And he's helping some local neighborhood urchin is helping to shovel out the ice and the snow. Drifts in the suburbs anywhere were pretty immense, and they would actually literally cover the top of the car. These guys are sitting on top of a snow sweeper in Adamsdale, and that is out near Pottsville, Yingling country. And usually the trolley, particularly in the suburbs, was then the only thing that was there open, and people, pedestrians, guys with horses would be out there. This is Old York Road, one of the private turnpikes. It was owned by Philadelphia Rapid Transit, so they threw all the snow over to the side, and if nobody could get through with their sleighs, well, they didn't care. They owned the road. Ice presented its own problems. It would tear down wires. It would get into the track, and you just couldn't get any power, or you couldn't stay on the track. And ice sometimes came down and had to be dug out, of course, by hand. This is a Wilkes-Barre car, early part of the 20th century. This ice came from the Susquehanna River, which was really right alongside to the right. An ice gorge is what the newspapers would call it, and they had to be dug out as well. And they sat on top of the roof, and if you got too much ice, well, there's another kaboom. And then you had to clear the cars out of the barn and, fix the structure. Fires, ice storms and fires, this happens to be an issue with fire, really messed up wires, and they would be torn down by the immense amount of ice, caused by the hoses. Strikes were no fun. And in the early part, about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the public got involved a lot. They would usually get on the side of the operators who were fighting with the company. And if somebody tried to take a car out, or the company brought in the scabs, even if their police were out there, they would massively attack. This is a car that operators both pulled off, windows smashed here in Pittsburgh. Back in the earlier days, the public was always on the side of the trolley operator. The strikes were a little more civilized later on. This is post-war, when a lot of strikes occurred in a lot of industries beside transit. Remember, wages had been frozen essentially during World War II. And so here are the strikers up at Luzerne Barn, and down at the right are their wives. And I just love that sign on the right, for once our husbands are right. The company had nothing to do with this. They just couldn't get their cars through. It was another union, the taking over a mill, a hosiery mill, right before World War II, about 1937 or 8. And both 50 and 75 cars are stuck. Here's the strike, though, that made a lot of news, and we'll talk about this more during World War II. And it involved the federal government, forcing the company, and there's a lot of other issues going on. There are two unions fighting. It's a very racist company, but the federal government says, the black people are a untapped resource, and we're drafting people, and we need to keep these trolleys running. We have all the women out there. We can get 300 or 400 of them, and you will hire blacks and promote them to the job of conductor and motorman, and they were the jobs, on the system. And the company dragged their feet, finally did it, and when the operators turned in or became actual operators, the whole union went on strike. And of course, it slowed production up. And I think on the 2nd of August, everybody, the military was in there pleading, please come back, come back. We need the bullets, we need the flamethrowers. It didn't happen. So on August 3rd, the Secretary of War ordered the Army to take over. The Army sent 5,000 men into Philadelphia. These are guys that are going to Normandy. We are going to fight for 3 months on the Normandy area, not too far from the beaches, just trying to clear the Germans out of the hedgerows. And yet they send this many men in. Philip Hayes is their commander, Major General, and he issues an interesting threat. And he says, all right, tomorrow's Monday, and if you're not back, you're going to be drafted. You're going to boot camp on Tuesday in California, and you will. you will go to the Pacific. And everybody was back the next day. This is the first car out. The Army would control the system for 6 weeks. They would ride the cars with fixed bayonets in some cases. And the soldiers, all smiling for the newspapers, but they were told, you will use force to keep the trolleys running. You're off track. You know, how does this happen? How does this happen? It'd be lovely to see this. They would go off in all different directions. This one hit a car, went off the track, hit another car, pushed the car into the pole in Philadelphia. Quite a mess. This is Washington, D.C. And again, you scratch your head. How in the world did this happen? But it did. Now, this one, I remember shooting this picture back in 81 or so, and I was standing on the bridge that carried Amtrak underneath Elmwood Avenue, and I decided to get a different view of the car coming up the hill, and the car I shot was that one. And I was standing literally right there, and I could have, you know, not been here today doing this show for you. Philadelphia brought out everybody, you know, the whole neighborhood. I'm sure some of them are passengers, but the other neighbors would come out too to view this. This was very exciting. This is in Bellevue, and I'm sure this is very exciting too, particularly for the guy that owned the house. The car took about 100 feet ride after it jumped off the track, and it really rolled up a wall and onto the grass here in Pittsburgh area. Toronto. Another car that sailed off the track. This one took out a utility pole before hitting the sidewalk. And I knew the operator who did this. And this was Pittsburgh. It was near Library. Back in those days, the tracks were really not in good condition. They hadn't decided yet whether we would have light rail or busways. And he remembers telling me he just all of a sudden soared off and down into the creek. Sawmill Run. That's your typical derailment. Now, I would have loved to have seen this one. Narrow shelf out here south of Easton, Philadelphia and Easton. The Delaware is over to the right. And the truck, if you'll notice, is down on the bottom. So, you know, you wonder, was he hanging down? I've seen several pictures from different views of them putting this on. I never saw how it happened. Here's a car that decided to go to the beach. Take the day off. And New Jersey, this is actually Atlantic City Transit, and the track, you know, ran along the beach, and I'm sure he sailed off into the sand. Buildings. Trolleys love buildings, it seems. This is Homestead, where he rolled down the hill in Homestead, West Street, I think, and another view of that. Quite a mess. And he took out the power here too, so it took him quite a long time to energize the car enough to get him out. And here was the door-to-door shopping, direct service. Come into the store, you know, get right off, buy something. And this was up, I believe, at Arlington Avenue. And it was down in Philly, 25th Street and Lombard. I know that because the sign is there. Baltimore. And this was the second car to run through the tunnel in Pittsburgh back in the early 90s. And this guy was an operator. He lost his brakes, was real smart, had only 45 people, got them all in the back of the car. It sailed through, stayed on its trucks, on its wheels, unlike the December 25th, 1917 car. Which rolled over, and he hit the P&LE station buildings. And this one broke apart after hitting a building down in East Pittsburgh, down near the Westinghouse plant. And then this one just took a ride. The owner of the home was very lucky. Nothing was damaged. Obviously, I'm sure the snow stopped this car, and I don't really know where this is. So if anybody happens to know, this is a postcard view that I was able to get. Up in the Jenny Lind section of McKeesport. I wonder if the operator lives there and was just parking his trolley to get lunch. This was a pretty bad wreck up there. So was this. These were the West Penn, the second system to operate in McKeesport. There were two there. And that destroyed two homes. And then you have the Laura line. It was a steep hill coming in. Those of you that are ECTMA know that's the Central Scranton Expressway hill coming into town, and car lost its brakes. It was a tight loop at the end, and he rolled around and came to a stop like this. A little engine that shouldn't. Railroads, and we have a little bit about that. The railroads were always dangerous places, and in most cases, especially in the earlier days, these weren't signaled, these crossings were not signaled, and it was up to the crew of the trolley, usually the conductor, to get off and make sure it was clear in both directions, and he would wave the trolley through. Now, they would all put these nettings up, and you can see above the trolley, that's a netting there, so it's arced, and if the pole was to come off during the crossing, that would stay energized, the car would stay energized, and it could move off the crossing and out of the line of any trains that were coming. This is down in Reading. And these are hand-operated gates. So we've become a little more sophisticated, and now the railroads had a busy railroad. This is down in Capouse Avenue in Scranton. They've got a guy in that tower, and he's got a series of pumps, and he's going to pump those gates down, usually 4. So he's protecting the car. And of course, there were many occasions when the train won. You weren't careful at a crossing. It's like today. It's not very good. There were 2 engines on this train here. Now, this was an interesting operation in Pottsville, going up to Minersville. The Reading Railroad actually owned a lot of stock for the Eastern Pennsylvania Railways, and before that, the Schuylkill Electric Railway. And both trains and trolleys operated on this single track. And there was very rudimentary signals on one line, the other line you were on your own. And so there were numerous accidents between the trolley and the train. One crew actually, within a year, the same crew got into 2 different accidents. And it wasn't very pretty out there. And they finally were able to end the accidents when they got rid of the line. Oops, sorry. But a smashing performance. Well, here we are in Forbes Avenue, Lower Hill, below the Lower Hill. And as you can see, motor vehicles never play nice with trolleys. There's 2 of them here. This was out in near Westchester. These little flivvers back then were called machines. In the newspapers, you always see a reference to machines. And you're not going to win. Those little cars, you're not going to win. And even when they got bigger, you're not going to win. This is down in Baltimore. The last day of service on the Dallas line. You know, you think you're just going to go out and not worry about anything. And but Mount Greenwood Cemetery, car got on the crossing, and this guy went right up over the car. And then, of course, you got the guy that's nervous. He's behind the trolley. He's got to get somewhere he can't pass, and he tries. And here comes another trolley the other way. Oops. And nobody's going anywhere for a while on this one, another Baltimore shot. And then trucks, of course, were likely targets as well. And sometimes the truck hit the trolley, and sometimes the trolley hit the truck, and sometimes the trolley flipped the truck over. And trolleys hit each other. This is down at 3rd and Smithfield Streets. 2 yellow cars. You know, you don't know if he lost his brakes. He wasn't paying attention. Not sure. Dr. Cox used this picture in his book on the early electric cars of Philadelphia, and I always loved it and was able to secure a copy finally. And as he called it, a tranquil day in West Philadelphia. And it's brought out the finest of people in the neighborhood. And then, of course, the trolley will go after a bus no matter where it is. This is a Cleveland car. Something hit this, you can tell by the side, and he's over on his side down in South Philadelphia, Route 29. So what, Tasker Morris streets? This is out again on the Dallas line. A lot of single track, NASHOD signals, yeah, but it was very easy to have a NASHOD misfunction, which I think happened here. And then we have the tunnel in Cincinnati that apparently wasn't braced well enough. And this guy went down. The subway tunnel was built, never really used, never used at all. In fact, I think bunches of it are still down below. You know, this guy, you know, went yahooing off the track, and there was a tree in his way. And then the safety campaigns, you know, to counter all of this, trolley companies always had safety campaigns, painted up special cars, and it didn't always work. Now, there were some pretty bad accidents as well, not nearly as many as all of these other incidents that we've seen, but there were accidents that did sustain casualties. And this was kind of an unfortunate one. It was on our interurban down near Canonsburg. And this couple had just come back from Penn State. They were registering at Penn State. They were going to live at Penn State. And the fella had driven all the way up, and he drove back, and he asked his wife to drive. And moments later, somehow she got in front of the car, the interurban car here. This one we know nothing about, but he went sailing off something up in Chestnut Hill. So it might be a Reading car coming down in. Scott Becker sent me this one once from Fairmont in West Virginia. And he left the track and probably traveled a bit. And there he is on the railroad. Castle Shannon down near St. Anne's. This isn't too bad. He's off pretty good, but not too bad. And once again, the whole neighborhood is out having a great time. This was a pretty bad one. Braddock Avenue and Library Street down here. Library Street has a hill, and it was a shuttle car that just went up and down the 6 blocks of the hill. And when it got to the top, you must, of course, change ends, get a pole up so that you got your air brakes to function. And apparently with a young woman cutting off and hurting her ankle, both crew members went to assist her. And the motorman was in the process of changing ends, and he forgot to put the pole up. Pole, you know, air drips off. He jumps on the car as it starts to move, got no brakes. He does ring his bell. He alarms a lot of people, clears most of the intersection. This guy crashes into a building on the bottom, but unfortunately some people had taken shelter in that building, and he went almost through the building. So here's the Christmas Eve accident that the car rolled down through the tunnel, trolley tunnel, without its brakes, and at the end he went on his side, and he killed a number of people there. I have no idea what happened here, but it looked like a fragile car. So I don't know if everybody was jumping off before he hit or what. And this was the classic accident up between Evansburg and Johnstown on the Southern Cambria. Involved a regular car and a carload of picnickers. This was postcard views of the big wreck on the Fort Wayne and Wabash over in Kingsland, Indiana. And postcards, these kinds of subjects, you know, as macabre as we might think they are today, they made big postcard money. Everybody wanted to buy a picture of this. Mon Valley, foggy, smoggy day, down around the Rankin Bridge when about 4 in the morning when one car crashed into another. It was very bad visibility. We had poor visibility around here anyway. This was out on the Red Arrow, and if you look behind the car in the back, there's double track. This guy was supposed to stop. The car over on my left was going to go through. It was the classic meet, the classic passing. And the newspaper said that the operator of that car in back in the rear got sick, slumped over the controls, and obviously lost control of his car. And this is obviously after they pull the cars apart. They haven't pulled anything apart here. And I have to research this one. I know nothing about it except there was a freight car, pretty heavy freight car, and one of the lightweight cars that they had gotten from Indiana. And of course, when they went through all of this, eventually, you know, they would just scrap them. And scrapping tended to involve usually burning the car and then taking the metal, the remaining metal, and sending it off to a steel mill. And in fact, Lehigh Valley Transit passed the steel mill, and they would just push the cars in, and they were burned in the mill and just dragged right into the furnaces. Here's Wilkesboro, South Wilkesboro, where the cars are being burned. That's a Pennsylvania Railroad decapod steam locomotive. And that is my tour of trolley accidents. I'll be around for questions. I want to thank all of you guys for joining me, even though I can't see all of you. It's been wonderful to speak to you.
Thank you so much, George. If you have any questions for George, please type them in the chat box now. We are using our chat box for questions today. And before we wrap up, I want to mention our other upcoming programs. Next Tuesday afternoon, volunteer Dennis Kramer will be telling us about the Allegheny Valley route just north of Pittsburgh, which hosted 3 streetcar lines that served this heavily industrialized area along the lower Allegheny River Valley. And George will join us again in about 2 weeks for a presentation called On the Warpath, Pennsylvania's Trolleys During World War II. And later in the month, we will host a virtual version of the Western Pennsylvania Trolley Meet, where we'll have a series of programs over the 2-day event and some more interactive sessions too, like a Share Your Slides program and a Trolley Museum showcase, where more than a dozen of the trolley museums around the region will actually be sharing some updates from their staff and volunteers. And links to sign up for these will be available shortly on our website, patrolley.org, so stay tuned. And thank you all for joining us today. If you liked the show today, and if you'd like us to help us continue our digital programs, you can make a donation at patrolley.org/support. And let's see what's going on in the chat over here. All right, and thank you to those who helped answer questions in the during the show. Wonderful. And if you guys have any feedback, if you go back to the original email that was sent out, you'll find my email address, assistant@patrolley.org, and look in your email for a survey in the next day. All right. And we'll wait just another minute in case anyone has questions that they're typing. But I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. This was the second in our Trolleyology series. Thank you so much to George for sharing. And thank you to those who reached out about last week's presentation, and some even offered to give presentations of their own, which was really exciting. If you'd like to sign up for the future presentations, you can go to patrolley.org. The links are posted on the website. You should see what's called a slider, kind of like a banner on our front page with the Trolleyology graphic. And you can click on that and sign up for the future shows. And we hope you can join us again in the coming weeks. Thank you guys again. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yeah.
Kristen, we do have one question.
We do?
We do, from Paul.
We do. What did some of the trolley companies do to avoid crashes? George,
Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can.
We can. Well, you know, I worked for the Port Authority for 34 years, and the one thing we constantly did was train and retrain. We found out that somewhere after about 10 or 12 years, you really had to start retraining operators. They got too complacent out there, and they wouldn't pay the proper attention. Younger operators paid a lot of attention. So the biggest thing was training and retraining. They would have instructors ride periodically with operators to watch what they were doing. And of course, they might suggest retraining. And of course, the track department was always behind in trying to get the track up to shape. And a number of these accidents were probably track related. Certainly the one that almost got me was definitely track related. And one of the operators coming up behind him had said, I was the third one this week. And so the track, if they could get it into shape, was really important. Other than that, a lot of this was operator error. Go too fast, not pay attention to a signal. And the signals, of course, had to be taken care of too. So a lot of it was preventive maintenance and retraining.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And thanks again, everybody, for coming. We look forward to seeing you next time.